Andrew is the president and co-founder of Investeco, which is the first investment company to focus exclusively on investing in environmental sectors. He also sits on a number of corporate boards, including Lotek Wireless, Triton Logging, and Rowe Farms Incorporated. And Andrew is the director of the Tides Canada Foundation and the steering committee on sustainable prosperity, and is a past chairman of the Sustainability Network. He also sits on the board of advisors of the Munk School of Global Affairs at the University of Toronto, and is the chair of the Premier's Climate Change Advisory Panel for the province of Ontario. So you can see that as an investor and as a corporate board member and as an advisor to government and NGOs alike, Andrew has many perspectives on the issues that we're trying to address today and what's needed in our business to develop a sustainable, prosperous future. So please join me in welcoming him, Andrew Heintzman. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. It's great to be here, and I really think this is just a tremendous event, talking about issues that are very important to me. It's particularly relevant time because this week, as was just mentioned, I'm on the board of the Tides Canada Foundation, and I've just come back from an all-day board meeting in Vancouver for the Tides Canada Foundation, and I joined this foundation a few years ago thinking it would be sort of a quiet, we'd sit up talk, we'd give out some money to some good causes, and a couple years later, we found we're in the midst of an all-out war. Basically, we've been called money launderers, radical foreign-funded radicals. I'm forgetting all the words. These are by ministers of the Crown, amazingly. We're being attacked by ethical oil, being attacked by Enbridge. It's been quite an amazing time. And of course, this is also part of a larger coordinated attack, I think it's fair to say, on the environmental sector and on all those who are there to speak against like sort of raw resource development the way the federal government would like to do it. And I'm sure you're all aware that in the current budget are some very profound rollbacks to environmental laws. And so I think it's also part of a kind of a strategy. These guys are good at the best defense is a good offense, and they know that, and they're showing it again by attacking people who will dare to question things. So it's really an interesting time. But if you pull back the kind of rhetoric and the invective and kind of look at what's happening behind the scenes, and I think what you're seeing is a view of economic development that this current government believes and espouses. And it's a view that basically suggests that the best way, or maybe the only way to develop your economy is through developing of raw resources and exporting raw resources to the world. And they believe that's fundamentally the way to develop the Canadian economy. And that therefore, if you oppose that, of course, you're opposing the Canadian economy, and this is where I think this incredible language comes from, because they just see that as kind of traitorous, And so that's the kind of narrative that this current government and a lot of their supporters, and I think that's sort of their frame on the world. But I believe there's a different frame, and it's one that we see daily in our lives as venture capitalists, of this growing group of innovative companies that are basically come from a different insight. And the insight basically is that the fundamental question of resources, using resources efficiently. And that innovation focused on using resources efficiently is the best way to grow an economy. So it's sort of it's a whole different perspective on what I would call a middle way. It's not about not using resources, but it's about taking a new approach to resource use. So I'm calling this in this presentation a green economy, and I want to try to advocate for a green economy, both for its environmental benefits, but also for its economic benefits. And I'm going to start by talking big picture, global issues. I'll try to dive down, talk a little bit about Canada. I'm going to talk about some of the companies that I think exemplify what a green economy would look like. And then I'll end with a couple suggestions or ideas, and a few I hope that bear on this region in particular, because I really believe Waterloo has an unbelievable opportunity to harness the power of the innovation of a green economy and really be leaders in the country, be a leading community in the country. So I thought I'd start with this. This is what we're all fighting about. Who has been to the oil sands? Has anyone been here from this? A couple people have been there. I went in 2008, and that's a picture I took from a helicopter flying over the Suncor facility. This is an open pit mine. This is what you would see. You'd see many of these if you're flying around the area around Fort Nelson. And basically, it gives you a sense of kind of the scale. I want to insert a pointer here. There's a tiny. It's a little hard to see, but there's a tiny little speck in the middle of there, and that is the largest vehicle in the world. It's I forget the name. It's called a Caterpillar 797, I think. It's 50 feet tall. You have to climb up a ladder to get to the driver's seat. The tires are probably as close to as high as the top of the screen. It's absolutely immense. In fact, I stood beside a number of them. And someone said to look at the trucks, and I was like, no, because I thought they were buildings. I mean, it's the size and scale of a building. So this just gives you a sense of how big we're talking about, the scale of this. And in the background, you can see the tailing ponds. These are the water that's been polluted. The St. Croix facility had the 1,400 ducks that died in the tailing pond. These are very large bodies of water. They're closer to the size of lakes. And in my view, this gives us a picture of what's happened in the last 100 years in energy. You know, the dawn of the energy age happened in places like Texas and California. You could drill a hole in the ground and it would unleash this huge gob of oil, what they call gushers, so much would come out. And it was very easy to access. And because it was so easy to access and so efficient, we built our economy around this plentiful resource. But over the last 100 years, you know, we've worked our way through a lot of that easy to access energy. We've come to the much more marginal projects. And just the view of this is really give evidence to the marginality of this. It requires a ton of energy to get the bitumen out. And it also creates a lot of environmental damages. And part of the reasons why this happened is because over the last 100 years, our population globally has grown so dramatically from 1.3 billion people at the dawn of the oil age to around 7.5 to 8 billion today, and I believe going towards 10 billion by 2050. And a lot of this has happened because of energy. You know, energy has been able for us to provide for so many more people, both in terms of just cooking, transportation, but also in terms of growing our food through synthetic fertilizers and the other benefits of hydrocarbons. But of course, it's not just the numbers of people, but it's also the way we live that's changed so dramatically. So this is a house that might certainly not look out of place in a number of communities in Toronto, but this is a house in China and Beijing. And so it shouldn't surprise us that what we still refer to as the developing world will aspire to lead the kind of lifestyles that we've become accustomed to in our world. And this, of course, is another reason why we're moving through this energy at such a rapid pace. And all of this, of course, leading to significant environmental problems, some of which we're here to talk about today. The largest and the most intractable in my mind is climate change. Just a quick graph showing the blue line is a business as usual case. The green line is the 2020 peak. If we're going to peak it by 2020, that's what sort of has to happen. And you'll notice that they start to diverge about today. So we really have almost no time to spare if we're going to deal with this significant global problem. And I was also at the COP13 in Cancun, and it is a discouraging view of the world, because if you've ever sat through those processes, you'll see that the global community is very unaligned, and that there's a lot of work to be done to get together on a solution to this problem. And so for us, both as environmentalists, but also as investors, this frames what I see as the really fundamental driving forces which are driving our world. These are the big challenges of the next 100 years. The demographics, growth in population, but also in the way we live, leading to resource scarcity globally, and then in turn leading to environmental problems like climate change. But, and we also believe that the scale of this, you can see it in terms of a capital response. So how much money will it take to start to address these concerns? And we did some significant work on this to look at this question. And right now, globally, we spend about $300 billion a year on things like efficiency conservation, pollution control mitigation, and renewable energy. And we believe that by 2030, that has to be on the order of $2.5 trillion globally. So almost a tenfold increase if we want to start to really address the significant problems that are lying ahead of us. But where there's challenges, there's opportunities, and it's one of the virtues of the capitalist free market system is that it can sometimes direct capital to places where it's needed to solve global problems. And we actually think that if you can think of capital as kind of waves of innovation, waves of capital investment, and they typically happen over like roughly a decade. They're interspersed by recessionary periods where the excesses of the previous wave are digested and the seeds of the next one are sown. And sometimes capital gets it right and flows into useful things, and sometimes it doesn't. We would say an example of capital getting it right is the 1990s, the huge investment in fiber optic cables, the internet, the huge development that happened that this community benefited, obviously, and grew some really powerful companies in that time. Of course, sometime around 2000, we had a market crash, and there was a lot of speculative stuff happening, and that's normal in an investment cycle. But we see today that we sowed seeds of efficiency in our economy during that period that we're now seeing the benefits of 10 years later, or more than 10 years later. We would say that the 10 years that came after that is an example of capital not getting right. It flowed into things like real estate development, especially in the U.S. And we saw a major bubble in the real estate market around 2008 and a crash of the markets. And we believe, though, that as we're slowly coming out of that period and we're starting to see our economies, especially North America, start to recover, the natural place for capital to flow is into environmental sectors, partly because of the scale of the problem. I mean, capital wants to go where there is scale, typically, where there are big things to invest in, transformative things, because, and that's the nature of where capital likes to move. So we believe areas like resource efficiency, renewable energy, energy efficiency, biofuels, water, these are examples of the kinds of themes that we believe will start to appear in the capital markets to create the next wave of investment. And it's going to happen again because of the scale, as I said, of what's possible. So just take one example, the smart grid. Now the smart grid, if you think about it, it's the coming together of some of the world's largest industries, including the IT industry and all that investment that happened in the 1990s, the electricity sector, and even the transportation sector. As our cars become driven by electricity, it also is going to merge into the smart grid. And so you can see, and it will also include our water utilities. And so it's a broad recreation and commingling of a number of the largest sectors in our economy. And this attracts corporate interest, this attracts capital. So you've seen companies like General Electric is a classic with their Eco-Imagination program, or Siemens in Europe. The car companies get interested in this space. You've seen large capital providers become interested in the smart grid. And it's why the world's preeminent venture capitalist, John Doerr from Kleiner Perkins in Silicon Valley, has said going green is the largest economic opportunity of the 21st century. I truly believe that's true. It's why we started our firm. We think that this is really where the economic opportunities are in the future. So what does this mean for Canada? And I think to answer that question, I'd like to go back to the origins of the Canadian economy. And really to the first Canadian company, which was the Northwest Company, started in Montreal by a group of Scottish merchants who made common cause with the Métis and the Coeur d'Ivoire and the native population, and they built this really fantastic, elaborate corporate enterprise that ran through the Canadian wilderness through the 1700s. And they went out to compete with the Hudson's Bay Company. The Hudson's Bay Company was owned from London, and the Hudson's Bay took their furs out through the Hudson's Bay. And then to compete with them, the Northwest Company built this intricate system through the Canadian waterways. And it really was the first Canadian company. By 1780, they controlled about 80% of the fur trade. And this is a map, actually. It's unfortunately a little fuzzy, but this is a map of all the fur routes that the Northwest Company developed by the early 1800s. And you can see it stretches the entire landmass of Canada, from the west to east. It's incredible to think that long ago, when there was such a sparse population in Canada, there was this incredible corporation that was moving through the wilderness. But one of the questions you might ask is, why did they have to go so far? What was driving them to go, to Fort Edmonton and all the way up to the west and east coast? And the answer to that question is because they were driven to go further into the wilderness because they were depleting the furs of the animal populations closer to Montreal and where their centers were. So in order to, and because they were successful, because they were taking over more and more of this growing industry, they were forced further into the wilderness to get access to the plentiful furs that they needed to sell. And so for me, this first resource company sort of sets the two faces of the Canadian resource economy. On one hand, incredible innovation, great kind of fortitude, and actually their motto is fortitude in distress, which is sort of a great saying. But the flip side was this propensity to diminish the natural resources on which they depended. And you saw it in the very next resource industry, the forest products industry, that happened actually right after the fur industry. And actually they used the very same waterways. So this is the Ottawa River in the 1800s and late 1800s. And they're using the very same waterways that the Northwest Company had developed for transportation. But of course it had the same negative impact, depletion of the resource on which it depended. And we've seen this time and time again. We certainly saw it in the fishing industry. When John Cabot came to Canada, he described a fish so plentiful you could drop a bucket and pull the bucket full of fish. By the 1990s, it was virtually gone and depleted. So the economist, the political economist who's written most about this, the most known to deal with this issue is Harold Innis, who wrote in the University of Toronto through the early part of the 1900s. And he talked about Canada as an exporter of staples to more highly industrialized areas in terms of fur, lumber, and finally wheat, pulp, and paper, and minerals. So he really saw this as a cycle. We kind of went from resource sector to resource sector, but we always had this failing that we were depleting our resources, and we were fundamentally reliant on exporting raw natural resources. And so this became what's been called the staples thesis. And Innis would say there are two weaknesses of the staples economy. And the first one is one I really want to focus on. It's economically vulnerable to what he called cyclonic shifts from things like commodity price changes, foreign levies, or even fashion changes. He talked about how if European fashion would change, the Canadian economy would be bent out of shape because now they want a different kind of fur than the one that we were producing. So you're always at risk of the end user of your product. And you can think even today how this applies. We're putting so much focus and emphasis on the oil sands, but just economically, there are a whole bunch of things that could happen that could make that a bad investment. For example, if natural gas prices were to rise dramatically, if the price of a barrel of oil was to decline dramatically, if a price on carbon was to be placed on the world economy, any of those things would have a huge impact. And these are the kinds of cyclonic shifts that Harold Innis was talking about. And of course, he recognized even at that time that they were also environmentally vulnerable to collapse from depletion of resources. And today we know that's even a bigger problem because these are interrelated resources. At the time, he was sort of concerned about how the fishing stocks would collapse. But now we know that has other ripple-on effects to other parts of our economy. And so I believe that we are going to be forced for economic and environmental reasons to consider and try to make a transition from a staples economy to the green economy that I was talking about earlier. And so if you think about it, a staples economy, it's really where wealth is based on exploiting raw natural capital without consideration to the external cost. That's the basic underlying thesis of a staples economy. And the green economy is where wealth is created from innovation, and in particular innovation focused on reducing external costs, or what I would call resource efficiency. And this is the nature of the transition. Now I've got about 7 examples of companies that I think exemplify this transition because I believe it's already happening, and I think we can see it all around us. And as a venture capitalist, we see examples of companies constantly that are really emblematic of this transition. So the first one I'm going to talk about is, and the other thing I want to say is, what's really intriguing to me is it's not a running away from the resource sector. In fact, very often it's sort of a reinvention of the resource sector and using innovation typically. So one example is a company called Triton Logging. The logging industry, as we know, has had a really bad decade. There are about 200 communities in Canada that are 100% focused on a single mill. They've been very exposed to the cyclonic shifts that Harold Innis is talking with, imposed tariffs on softwood lumber at the U.S. border. The collapse of the building market has really hurt a lot of these communities. But what's interesting to me is out of the ashes of that, some new ideas are emerging. So Triton Logging is a company that's focused on underwater logging. Underwater logging happens around the world where there are reservoirs of standing forests typically. And those have been created in all around the world where hydroelectric facilities have been created. So Triton logging today is logging on a lake in Ghana called the Volta Lake. Very significant reservoir, like probably over $1 billion worth of flooded timber, which has never been taken out, never been remediated, never been sold to market. And so what happened in this case is an entrepreneur saw this vast global market that no one had ever tapped, no one ever tried to do anything about it. And he came up with a technology, a way to try to make it commercial. And so he invented, this is a fellow called Chris Doddsell, he invented what you see there, the Sawfish. It's an underwater logging tool. It's an unmanned submarine. It dives down, if you go down to the depth of 350 feet, it grapples onto a tree, it's got cameras to identify the tree. Industrial saw comes out, it cuts the tree. One of the things they had to figure out was how to get the tree to the surface, because they've been underwater so long they tend to sink. So it staples airbags in, inflate them, the tree comes to the surface, and they harvest it. And as I said, this is happening now in Ghana. They have another tool called a shark, which is a shallow water harvester, which they're really more using in Ghana. But they're pulling out incredible varieties of tree species like ebony that have very significant global markets and are hard to get on land right now. So it's, for me, a classic example of how an entrepreneur can see a resource that others can't see, and by using innovation can actually turn it into something commercial. Another example is the biofuels market. Also still in the lumber industry, Canada, because of our history in the forest products industry, we have this huge amount of slash of kind of waste biofuel, which is just the excess of the lumber industry. And so companies like Ensign out of Ottawa have figured out a way how to make a real commercial use of this. And Ensign has a process called fast pyrolysis. It flash heats the woody biomass, turns it into what they call a pyrolysis oil. And this can be used for transportation fuel. It can also be used in a diesel generator to make electricity. Ensign is a really interesting company. I would keep your eye on it because they just recently entered into a joint venture with Chevron globally and with Honeywell. And it looks like they can very commercially create transportation fuel and even a total replacement transportation fuel. So it wouldn't be just added to regular gasoline, but actually be completely replace gasoline. But this is just one example. Woodland Biofuels, Enerchem, you can go, there's 6 or 7 Canadian companies that are global leaders in this sector. Another example is the water industry. Canadians have been very successful at innovation in this space. We've had companies in Ontario like Xenon, which really invented the reverse osmosis membrane and was sold to General Electric for over $1 billion. Companies in the UV space like Trojan Technologies. This is a little company out of Vancouver that I ran into about 1.5 years ago, and they have a system to desalinate water, which is sort of the holy grail of the water industry. We have all these communities around the world that are living near salt water but don't have access to fresh water, and the problem has always been the energy cost is so prohibitive that desalination plants have really not worked for many communities. So they have a system that he calls a saltwater battery that basically uses passive solar energy and can convert salt water into fresh water. And they were just recently invested in by, I'm going to forget the name, but they did a fairly significant round of financing recently. And it's just a great example. This could be easily a $100 billion market worldwide, in the next couple of years. The solar industry, we hear a lot about this sector, so I won't go on too long. But it's a vast industry with huge global potential, growing very dramatically. This is a little company in Toronto called Morgan Solar that has a solar concentrator. They believe that they can produce solar electricity at lower than grid price. So it would be a dramatic change. And they also just raised a significant amount of financing, about $40 million to commercialize this technology. The biomaterials market is really interesting. A company called Ecosynthetics went public last summer. They're making, taking a corn basically and turning into a bioresin to be sold in the paper market. That's just the first application of many that they are expecting to produce. And I think that's going to, as I said, the capital market's kind of like the full of success. And this was a very successful IPO last year, so I predict that there will be many more companies following in the space of this. Even just the consumer market, and this is a space that we do a lot of work in. Local company called Organic Meadow, just out of Guelph, Ontario, that really sells into this low-hash marketplace, what they call lifestyles of health and sustainability. That's what the acronym stands for. It's a $350 billion market in North America. This is a great little dairy company that we had a joint venture with the cooperative of dairy farmers and built a brand that's done very well in the market over the last number of years. I wanted to mention a local company called Myovision Technologies. So for me, this is an example, I think, of innovative green economy company, almost sort of a perfect example. We lose about $100 billion a year in productivity and pollution because of our congestion on our highways. This is actually that's in the U.S., so it's probably more than that. It's probably more like 110 if you consider Canada. And typically, our response has been to build more highways. But companies like Myovision are figuring out ways to collect data to move cars more efficiently. And it's again the coming together between that kind of IT investment applied to sort of resources and how we live and move around in our communities that I think has huge potential. And so I think there'll be many more companies like this that focus on transportation and efficient transportation by not building highways, but rather thinking about how we're moving around cities. This is a wonderful little company. We actually are investors in this business, and it came out of the Acceleration Center, which I'll talk about in a moment, but I'm really impressed by this management team as well. I think some of you know it. This also, this innovative economy goes right to the core sectors of the resource economy. And one of my great frustrations is that we've been talking about the oil sands and either defending the oil sands or trying to shut them down, but paying scant attention to the things we can do to make the oil sands actually more efficient, and there's quite a number. So this is just one example. A company called Enstall, and they believe that they can reduce the emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, in the in-situ projects. So these are the projects that are too far below the ground to be dug up the way I showed earlier. So they're not the open pit mines. They use a process called SAG, steam-assisted gravity drainage, to go down and basically heat up that bitumen and kind of suck it out. And this is what a lot of the natural gas is being used for in the oil sands. This company has a different solvent that boils at a much lower temperature and therefore requires significantly less energy to be able to heat up the bitumen and extract it. And again, a really dramatic potential change. And there are hundreds of companies like this that are underfunded or not being focused. And part of the problem is we have no policy framework to allow these companies to bring their ideas to market. So it's a real missed opportunity. But again, the point is, this innovation can happen right inside the resource sectors themselves. It's not we're not fighting the resource industry. We're rather proposing new ways for it to behave more efficiently. And so if you step back, I hope you start to see that there's this possible transition from a staples economy to a green economy. And just to go through the examples again, from a focus on dimensional lumber and the forestry industry, which is what we've done historically, to instead a focus on things like fast pyrolysis or gasification. The water sector, from just chemical purification to looking at things like desalination, ultraviolet purification. In agriculture, moving from just thinking of commodity crops to looking at things like probiotics, nutraceuticals. And the transportation sector, instead of just highway construction, let's think about smart highways. In oil sands, instead of just open pit mines, let's think about process efficiency, greenhouse gas emissions reductions. And in energy, instead of just focusing on fossil fuel production, we can start to think about renewables and smart grid development. And this again, as I said, the transition happens because we see that in the green economy, value resides in creating value-added products through new processes, technologies, methodologies, and brands. And it comes with a key entrepreneurial insight. I'm not sure how many of you are starting businesses or running businesses, but when I meet entrepreneurs, I really see that there's a fundamental different way that they're looking at their business. And Ezra Pound called the artist the antenna of the race, but I think in a way you could say the same of the entrepreneur, who's sort of looking into the future and considering the conditions of the world at some point in the future. That's really, they're not so much building their business for today, but they're building it for some point in the future. And so they tend to have that ability to see out. So if the entrepreneurial insight of the staples economy was really that natural resources are plentiful, almost limitless, and their only value is to be used as raw materials. And we can, you can imagine the first Europeans in Canada would have looked at these endless tracts of forests, endless biodiversity, and it would have seemed that you could have never depleted it. But of course, we know now that they are limited. And so this gives rise to the insight of the green economy, that natural resources are scarce, preserving them creates value in and of itself, and developing a process to use them most efficiently is the biggest commercial opportunity. And this is, I think, what John Doerr talks about when he says going green is the greatest commercial opportunity of our time. It's that insight that it's embedded in resource efficiency, that if we can learn how to do these things more efficiently, there's incredible commercial potential. So I want to just talk about a couple suggestions on ways that we can develop a green economy, and hopefully maybe touch a bit on some of the local questions you may have. So I think there are many things we can do, but there's four that rise to the top of my list. One is to have sufficient risk capital, because we're talking about starting new companies and funding entrepreneurs, so there has to be some risk capital in the market for that. It has to be the right regulatory environment, and I've got a specific idea on what that looks like. There has to be the right people and labor market. And then I also believe we have to build innovation hubs where these ideas can emerge. So on the first one, unfortunately, the story is not very good. On risk capital in Canada, it's a pretty terrible 10 years. So we've gone from around $6 billion of venture capital to around $1 billion in 10 years. It's a total washout. There's a whole bunch of reasons for it. One of the reasons is our pension funds are not actively investing in venture capital, and typically they're getting out of the game. One of my frustrations is one of the programs, probably you know a lot about the SHRED program, but the SHRED program is one of the programs that really is providing capital to startup entrepreneurs, and unfortunately it looks like that may be pulled back slightly, although the details of it are not totally clear, but the government is going to produce the amount of SHRED financing. So we're faced at a time where there's less and less risk capital in the market, and I think this is a fundamental headwind that we face. I'll get to this moment. It strikes me that your community is one of the few that is really doing this well, where you actually have a system of bringing angel investors and executives to work with early stage companies. And I think that's just absolutely critical to be successful. So in light of that, how do we build a regulatory framework?
What kind of criteria do you use in terms of assessing
Yeah, good question. So we first have a kind of sectoral criteria. Does it fit? Is it within one of our sectors? And usually in our offering memorandum, it depends on the fund. We've kind of defined the sectors that we're going to be focused on, and they always have some component of environmental aspect to them. So the fund previously was kind of a clean tech fund and had a kind of resource productivity focus. So we'll also kind of look at is there an environmental benefit? So things like my vision would be an example where we actually looked at, okay, what are the greenhouse gas emissions reductions from this? Is it sort of marginal, or is it material? So that one, it's a bit of a qualitative assessment. We basically run it by our advisors who are big investors, and we'll say, here's the company, we think it fits sectorally, and here's the impact it has. And it's not kind of, we're not looking for a specific number. We're basically looking for them to agree with us. So if they all agree, then we will then view it as something we can invest in. And then we do, from there on, we do really a traditional venture capital process. So we're looking for companies we call expansion stage or growth stage. So they're typically early stage private companies where they have commercial revenues, usually between 2 and 10 million in commercial revenues. They have to, they have to have a certain growth rate. So we're typically looking for companies that are growing more than 20% a year. They have to have the right capital needs. So if they need $100 million, we're not the right group. We're not big enough. If they need, $5 million, then we're sort of the right group. They need to have a reasonable valuation that we can get our heads around. We have to, like the management team, we usually we're typically looking for a board seat, so there has to be those kinds of fee. They would have to want to have us actively involved in their business. And then, then we do all the kind of traditional due diligence that a normal venture capital firm would do from that point on.
Using your experiences from Hyde and also as an investor, are there, so in both these cases, you're looking at specific applications, you've time to kind of dig into it, both from a finance side and from the environmental side. But how would an organization like a credit union or a bank, you evaluate that same money and value without taking so much time and having that same expertise in each case? Is there...
How do they do that?
Would there be a process that they could transfer over?
Yeah, so the only traditional financial institution that I know that really kind of does what we do is Van City Capital in Vancouver. It's the only one that has that kind of blended value consideration. There may be others. I just blanking on them. But any traditional bank is not. That's just not on their radar. Like they're just going to do a normal earnings analysis, balance sheet and income sheet analysis. But Van City's different. So they're doing this, and they're doing loans, and they're doing convertible loans, and they're starting to get into equities. And it's because the credit union board of directors have really focused on it as an area of expertise, and they're really focused on giving back to their community, investing in the community. I wish there was. I mean, to me, they're just a shining model. Like Van City is an incredible organization. I love what they do, and they've embraced this wholeheartedly. By the way, they also invest in and support not-for-profits and charitable organizations, which I think is really innovative because we're used to thinking of very binary thought that anything that's not a for-profit business is kind of not a business at all. But they've made a number of investments into non-share capital entities. So they're the only one I can think of, and they do kind of a similar thing, I think, where they assess both the kind of social environmental value and then the investing value of their investment. And I wish there was another. I wish there were more in Ontario like it.
You're the first environmental investment company in Canada. Do you see in the future that there will be many more or a few more from competitors that there's greater demand from consumers for such companies?
Yeah, I do. I mean, part of me wonders. I mean, I guess I'd love it there to be a day where there wasn't. Everyone was an environmental investor in a way. That it was sort of became more so mainstream that you couldn't differentiate. If you look at Europe and the U.S., this stuff has gone much deeper into the society, and I'm not sure why it hasn't in Canada yet. I think it's for two reasons, or maybe more than two. But let me try two. One is we're just very conservative culturally, and second is that our economics tend to be controlled by a small number of very large institutions who have not been interested in doing anything very innovative. It's maybe a little harsh, but they haven't seen the need or the importance of innovating in this regard yet. And so I don't know. I think what may happen is it's going to start to happen elsewhere, and then we're going to sort of pick up on it. There's a big current of activity coming out of the foundations and endowments and what they're calling impact investing. And foundations like the McConnell Foundation in Montreal are sort of driving this, and there's going to be an impact investing. Well, there is an impact investing center at Mars in Toronto, and so that community is going to drive some change. And I think eventually this will percolate up, but our banks and pension funds have not been very. They just haven't really. They're just very conservative, so they haven't really embraced it.
I wonder if you could speak to what you started your session on, which was the conservative government right now, and
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think, to be honest, we've all been taken really off guard. I just think no one saw it coming, and no one. I think we've all thought, Canada is a place where environmentalism would be always embraced somewhat, and that people would not use these sort of really harsh attack tactics on people who were involved in civil society. There was just sort of an agreement that we wouldn't go to that place. And so now that it's happened, I think everyone's kind of grasping for what the right response would be, it strikes me that the attacks were very coordinated. I call them coordinated. I think they are coordinated. There's been groups set up like this group Ethical Oil, which is, it seems that it's funded by Enbridge and other oil concerns, and they're very tied into the Prime Minister's office. So people have really thought this through and had come up with a position and an attack that people on our side were just not ready for. Now, let me flip it around. I think it's also an opportunity. I think the environmental movement has been saying the same thing for a long time, has not evolved fast enough. And this kind of, this shake-up may, in the long run, be an all right thing in terms of causing us to reconsider what we really believe in. I was mentioning I was at a Tides board meeting, and we had a great meeting, and there was tons of energy, and people were so, they were just there and really present and really ready to rethink things. So I think the environmental movement's Canada's going to go through a reconsideration, and I'm hoping that part of what's been happening is the environmental movement's been framed as anti-industry, anti-business, and I think it's vital that we reframe it, that that's not the truth at all. Rather, we're promoting another vision of what industry and business should look like. And I think that's potentially a winning argument. I also think that because the attacks have been so dramatic, they're going to cause people who otherwise had sort of petty grievances to sort of work together. And that may be on a political level, or that might be on just sort of supporting each other or helping each other, banding together in a way that they hadn't done previously. So I think everyone's kind of going through oh my God, the oh my God moment is maybe over, and it's like now, okay, let's respond. I think there's many ways people can respond. They can respond by donating to charitable organizations. They can respond by talking with their friends and family. The virtual world gives us all these opportunities to get messages out. I think they can respond politically in the way they vote. And so I think, and it may be a real opportunity for the environmental movement to find its grassroots again, and to motivate itself to move, to act as a movement again, and look for allies. There's going to be, I think there's allies in the oil sector, quite frankly. I think if I was an oil company, I'd be seriously not happy with this, because these things have a way of lurching back and forth. So this could easily swing right back into a period of significant environmental regulation. And so there's going to be allies out there that are going to be very uncomfortable. Even some, the CEOs, major corporations are I think, potential allies on this. So it may be an opportunity for the environmental movement to make inroads back to its allies and to get out of kind of a ghettoized posture and to reinvent itself.
I have a quick question for those talking. You mentioned a number of things about this community that I think is there anything you think we're missing that can really attract those knowledge workers and this kind of development that you're sort of talking about?
That's a really good question, and I don't know the community well enough that I don't want to say something and be wrong or offend someone or something. The one question I have is, and I don't know this, but how are you going to deal with public transit? I think it's the same question we have all across Ontario, but hopefully you've got a good answer to that. And I think about in the long run will be critically important for this community to become everything it could be. And active transport too, like the ability to walk and bike, I think is really important. And that that question of finding kind of places to densify so I would say it's probably about land, the development of land and community in that regard that will be critical. It strikes me, you've clearly got the education, you've clearly got the innovation, you've got the entrepreneurs, you've got the risk capital. Those things seem to be 10 out of 10. So can you do the other things to make it a sustainable community that's going to draw people in and really make it an excellent place to live?
Well, thank you, Andrew, so much. Another round of applause for you.